very much, Anna, for a very interesting meeting. And for me, it was also fieldwork because I'm studying critical zones like Steve. And so I also got lots of ideas. It would have been more interesting probably to do summary or synthesis of what we did during the 1 day and a half, but that would have required more energy and work, and it's impossible at the end of the term. So I will stick to my original argument, which is drawn from the Facing Gaia project. This is, by the way, pictures of a piece of earth, not the soil, but ice, which I had a chance to capture when I was going to Canada for another meeting, where you see the earth was actually screaming back at me when I'm in the plane, and knowing that we now, when we look at outside the plane, we know that we have a connection and a responsibility with what happened outside, because our own flight is responsible for the destruction of a spectacle you see, which is an interesting question of feedback, which destroys the notion of sublime. So before we could have looked at and feel the sublime, now the sublime is gone. We are crushed by the responsibility, and the ice pack itself is screaming back at us. So I saw this meeting as one aspect of a very general turn toward new materiality. I just set of books which are just on my desk. Of course, on our highway, and Thing, which is probably one of the most important spirit and symptom of what is now interested in this general turn, which basically, and I see the soil as one aspect of the general turn to land. The whole civilization looking for where to land, at least Western civilization. The others had been dislodged from the land. And this is why books like How Forests Think by Eduardo Cohn, or the book by Clive Hamilton, Deficient Earth, or by Deprez on animals. Everywhere you see this turn back to land, ground, let's say ground as a general term, regrounding of philosophy, regrounding of anthropology. Even sociologists now are able to reground themselves in parts. And this the soil, I think, is one part of that big changes. And also, very interestingly, I could have done the whole lectures of that, also true in art. This is the exhibition I did in ZKM last year, with some of the work about indicating a turn away from green. When you associate green with ecology, actually it's brown and layered, and it's a whole sort of aesthetic change, which is visible everywhere now in art places. There are 3 exhibitions right now in Paris and Lyon, where young artists are actually trying to dig literally in the ground to make works of art, which is probably one aspect of the trend that you mentioned in your talk. And my own interest, as Anna has reminded you, is an old interest in soil science, but as Stephen showed you this morning, and now I understand why, those people who I was studying 30 years ago were considered as very low in the pecking order of scientific discipline compared to other people I had studied who were laboratory scientists. And I was always worried at the time, and I'm very surprised, and I say that your science, earth science, soil science should be central, because it's the sort of linkages with all of the other disciplines and all of the other life forms we are concerned with. And they were completely marginal. And this is why in 30 years, those people are now, as visible in this meeting here, central again. Of course, it's a different definition. It's not pedology as it was, a classificatory discipline, as was mentioned several times. It integrates, it has increased its thickness and the numbers of entities with which it's actually now dealing with. But still, I was right to think that those disciplines should have been central 30 years ago. And now they are, for reasons which I, of course, did not expect. But the real reason is that I'm interested in not exactly as the soil, but as the political figure. And that's why when Anna asked me to come, I was immediately interested Because this meeting, rediscovering the soil, 5 years ago, in any intellectual places, would have been considered as deeply reactionary in spite of your book, because it was associated with the despise of the left for many, many years, actually, as Karl Borelli has shown from the beginning of the 19th century, with reactionary politics. So association with the soil is always going somewhere around this attractor, which I call the land of old, which of course is a complete fantasy, which is precisely where we would have seen a few years ago any interest for the soil as a return to the past, and something which precisely would have, which is now visible in Poland, in England with the Brexit, everywhere, in France with the National Front, in Italy with the League of the North, and of course in America with Trump, which is that this idea that the other attractor, the one which I call the globe of modernization, largely the globe of cartography, the globe of geography, the globe invented by the one who have actually built the whole notion of extensive coordinates, is now being disputed, and people say modernization and globalization is gone. So I'm interested in the figure. What does it mean to rediscover the soil? Does it mean an extension of globalization? Does it mean a return to the land of old, with all the ambiguity that we hear in the magnificent paper on India that Munch gave? Clearly there's an ambiguity. Is it going back this way? Is it a sort of reactionary politic once again? A return to ethnic basis? Or is it, on the contrary, what I call the third attractor, which I call, for some reason, I have no time maybe to develop, the unknown earth? Because this one is actually the one described in many of your papers. It's something for which we have no vocabulary, we have no clear vocabulary, because it's very actually difficult to describe, and that's where soil is actually, the soil we discussed in these 2 days is located. It's not the soil in the sense of the soil, what I would call the blood soil, the soil what you have to defend, the war and sort of order war type of soil, but it's not the soil either which could be called the global soil. So it's interesting politically to know where the definition of rediscovery is going on. Is it rediscovery of this, rediscovery of that, or rediscovery of that? Now, the reason why my diagram, which I proposed 1 year ago, has taken a great deal of validity, is because of this man. Because by abandoning the climate conference, he has succeeded in what the Green never managed to do, what even the Pope never managed to do, which is to repoliticize the new climate regime at an amazing point. So we have now a fourth attractor, which is interesting because it's a completely implausible one, which is going offshore. That is out of any sort of connection with any geopolitical realistic Earth. But by doing this, it clarifies where we should go. So in a way, I always argue that Trump is the first completely ecologically based government, because it's obsessed by the elimination of the geopolitical condition. And if you follow his back, you just have to do exactly the opposite to go where we should land, so to speak. So the general this is a diagram of the general political position where we are. And you can place yourself there to decide. For instance, you the Indian guy, you describe, are there somewhere here, or on the contrary, somewhere here, simultaneously playing on the national ethnical sort of spirit, but also allowing us to rediscover, and for themselves also to rediscover Earth, which is also associated with many modern science as well. So the geopolitics of soil, and more generally of where we land, has been enormously clarified thanks to Mr. Trump. And of course, in the old dispute between left and right, we would have worked between this thing, which would have been get out of the land. I think one of the first speakers yesterday said, soil is what we left behind with great urge and pleasure. We all are from family who said, let's get out of that boring countryside soil-based land, right? So the extraction and the emancipation from the land was a great movement, and emancipation, the whole left and right was along this line here. So when we heard the return and rediscovery of the soil, there is an ambiguity. Are we going back here? Are we going back to a sort of definition of the ground that we had left before? So the demodernization with all the reactionary politics which is associated with it? Or are we in fact, which I think we are, looking for a place to land? That landing and grounding politics is very, very different from what it was here, and it is very different from the modernist ideal as well. And we didn't see that as clearly now, and thanks to Mr. Trump, we see what it is to completely define a politic offshore. That is, we don't share the geopolitics on which you guys work. Climate is not for us. We have no climate problem, no climate problem. We go on. And we go on in something which is neither modernization, because it's completely playing actually in the return to the land, but we don't return to the land, we return to the most extreme forms of capitalism, finance capitalism. No, not even finance, even more abstract. TV reality capitalism, something extremely ungrounded. Interesting that Trump is actually a real estate guy and indebted. So it's really the complete abstraction of what it is to own land, which is only real estate and debt, which is a very interesting way. So we have to choose where we put the soil. And this is, I think, what is the intention here, where every one of us, we try to find ways of grounding, landing, if you want, because we will never be modern. I knew that, but now we know that we have only, what did he say, 20 kilometers, then 20 kilometers of land for everything else in the next millenary. So modernization is gone. Going back to the land of old is reactionary. Following Trump is basically escapism. So we have to find many, many ways to define this big attractor again, and that's difficult. Of course, one of the terms we have to do that is the old dispute around the Anthropocene, with all this dispute, but it's a nice code name. I know it has been discussed, most disputed. Most of my feminist friends say Anthropocene is a terrible word. Still, I think it's a very good word, precisely because it puts the notion of what human is in question. Of course, it's not very good in terms of social sciences, but it materializes and especially geologizes and soil, in the English sense of the expression, soil human, in a very useful way. So this is one of the many images you know of the. And of course, the soil of the Anthropocene is only now part of that. So there's no way to now talk, and I think we all agree, about an authentic, natural, back to land of old of the soil. But the soil of the Anthropocene is part of that big set of completely artificial retransformation of climate, soil, subsoil, and of course the ocean. You all know that very well. So the Anthropocene has the great advantage of getting out of the notion of natural, in terms, either in terms of wilderness, but also in the term of authenticity. We are living, and we will live in the ruins of what we did to this soil. And if you have a doubt, just cross the picked path to see that we still live, although it's a path and a historical path. It's actually the ruin of another human activity before. So the notion of ruins, as it has been argued by Hannah Singh, I think is very important because it's out of the notion of project. We are not in the project of modernity. Ecology is not something we will get out of. We will be deeper in it, but we are not. It's not a crisis. It's a mutation. So all of this argument about living in ruins, I think about other temporality, which is better associated with any of the sort of temporality associated with modernism. It was supposed to be always going to the globe, to the global horizon, emancipating ourselves. We will not emancipate ourselves. And of course, that's a key thing in the first speaker's book, which is a turn in a whole set of metaphors and figures which were associated with the left, which have to be reused and reassociated with a progressiveness which is no longer linked to the emancipation to the globe. So, and that's a great paradox of all of the political dispute that we would have to live through in the next decade, probably. Just one example of a recent paper on the Anthropocene equation. It gives you this is not a perfect storm argument. It's just an idea of where we might land if it's a completely different status. Anthropocene is interesting because it's not a modification of the environment. This has been going on forever. The Pict Park would be an example, but it's a transformation of the Earth system. And here, meaning that we not only are engaged into the question of responsibility, but we are engaged also in the argument that it's too late. So if it's a change of state, we are already in this change of state. This is a very, the mathematics of it are beyond me of this paper, but what is nice is that instead of sort of fluctuation around two attractors, there is a third attractor there, which bears some sort of resemblance with my third attractor. We are moving to a completely different space. And I think that's an interesting, every article in this Anthropocene review journal is absolutely fascinating as well as terrifying. Now the second element which is linked for me to the soil, and place the soil politically in my triangle, historically in the notion of Anthropocene, is of course my work on Lovelock, the figure of Lovelock and the notion of Gaia. We are in the department of geography, which in a few years will be called the department of Gaiagraphy, if we follow, because Gaia immediately gets a much better set of metaphors and stability than nature. So the great thing about Gaia is that it's not nature, and actually the notion of an interest for soil or critical zone could be an alternative to the notion of nature. Nature is too big. Nature includes everything from here to the Big Bang. I mean, it's a vast ocean of argument, and philosophical argument. And the nice thing with Gaia is that it's local. And actually the great first discovery by Lovelock is a very simple argument that this chemical imbalance of the Earth is a local thing. It's not what planet all planets are, it's not what Mars and Venus are. So it's a very simple relocalization of many of the arguments which were made by the prince and saint of pedology, Vernadsky, but which had not been actually mobilized before. That's my reading of Lovelock. This is Lovelock with his daughter. Now what is interesting in Lovelock is completely, this is the argument that I'm sure you know, this is the first discovery of the chemical imbalance of the Earth compared to the other one. The point with Lovelock is that it's completely misread and misunderstood, especially in Britain. It's one of the great scientists of Britain, but it is constantly misread as a strange maverick who has imagined that the Earth is an organism and that it has a sort of providential attitude, as if it was a sort of natural god of some sort, even though it wrote constantly exactly the opposite. But as you know, I know that very well for myself, people never read, that they just interpret. So in fact it's very interesting now to look carefully at Lovelock's set of discoveries, because it bears directly on the question of the political question. I mean, Lovelock's political position is completely awful, and I'm not interested, but and now it's very senile. But it's not the politics, it's the science of Lovelock which is really interesting. And what is really interesting, and it's now very clear in a recent thesis by this French historian of science on Lovelock, is that he came to the notion of Gaia through the question of pollution. He was very good at instrument, he was very good at making very precise instrument, and which allowed him to be financed by all the bad characters of the corporate world, which is quite funny. I mean, he lived on the money of Total, BP, etc., which allowed him to have a private sort of career, because he was actually detecting the pollution of all these bad guys, which is an interesting way of answering for someone who is sometimes considered as an ecologist. So he was paid by all these people to measure their pollution and to give report on this pollution. And then he crossed and that's really the source, as Dutreuil shows in his thesis, the source of a great argument. He crossed the Earth disequilibrium, which he had discovered before when he was in Pasadena, with this notion that, after all, if human could be able to produce such pollution that he, Lovelock, could detect so precisely everywhere, then life forms could do that as well. So it's actually, interestingly, Lovelock's argument is Anthropocene before the letter, so to speak. It's the argument that it's an extension of the argument of the action of life forms from human to the rest of the life form. It's a very interesting redescription of Lovelock. And the link between Lee and Margulis is, of course, very important. The power of Gaia's argument is the link between the macro level sort of cybernetic model that Lovelock uses, and Margulis, which, as you all know, is the one who modified the very definition of what is a species, what is a microbe, what is a cell, at a completely different level. And that's, of course, much closer from what we heard about the soil. So the interesting of Gaia, which the word was not mentioned once, actually, and I've read almost all the papers. I mean, you mentioned mother's figure, but that's precisely something that is not what Lovelock follows. The word Gaia as a concept is exactly the concept, in my view, which allows all a sort of connection between microbes and the whole atmosphere, and yet it's completely disregarded. And if you ask a geologist, are you a Gaiologist, they usually sort of flee away, especially in Britain. It's not true everywhere, but it's an interesting test that you can pass if you want. And for me, so this is why I think it is as interesting as Galileo, as precisely for a reason which is crucial to the politics of science, which is if we follow the term Galilean object, to describe the universe as it has been built by the scientific revolution in the 17th century, the Lovelockian agent which he introduced, and it's not an organism, it's precisely the interspread of all this life form, is a great alternative. The word is not made of Galilean object, the word is made of Lovelockian, the word, Gaia's very small pellicule is made of Lovelockian agent. So the shift from object to agent is, of course, one of the things we are all interested politically, because it's not the same word. And this is, again, a mistake which is always made when people study Lovelock, or by that matter study soil, is to confuse the metaphor of the organ as a definition of a whole, instead of saying what is interesting in Gaia is that all of the phenomena we observe on this very small skin, which is called Gaia, has been modified by organisms. So it's much more like a termite mound. It doesn't mean the termite mound is alive. It means every little bit of the termite mound has been munched and shit by termite. So it's not an argument about the life form itself. This is why all the religious metaphors don't work at all when you study Gaia. Gaia is actually, I think, the only secular, absolutely secular definition of the earth. But it's, on the contrary, the possibility of not making the mistake of considering that because a dam by beavers has been artificially made, it's actually alive. Of course it's not alive, but every single aspect of what you see has been sectioned, transformed, metamorphosed, mobilized, shifted by life form. So it's a different argument, the argument which is always associated with Lovelock, which is in fact completely traditional, pre-18th century or 18th century version of natural theology. That's why I gave a default on natural theology on this question, because natural theology is actually exactly what Lovelock took the Gaia out. And also Gaia in terms, that would interest Nicolas, in terms of mythological metaphor, is an absolute pitch. So the interesting thing is that the combination of Gaia as a scientific term and Gaia as a mythology is a great, mythologically she's the worst possible person, and the citation Gaia as a bitch is actually Margulis herself. It's not, I would not use it before. So the one with Gaia is that it's a bit big. And I'm interested in critical zone observatory, and I can go fast because we have heard a lot about critical zone, thanks to Steve, is to get a grasp on exactly the same question as the one which are raised by Lovelock, but at another level, which is precisely, interestingly enough, very often water catchment level, or much smaller size, which allows for ethnographic observation, which is what my job is. So the critical zone is itself interesting as a figure, because we have no, actually, and I would be interested in discussing alternative, maybe Nicolas has in its own portfolio, I don't know, is that the very notion of studying the skin of the Earth and not the globe, or not the planet, is actually fairly difficult to visualize. And critical scientists, critical zonists, as I call them, are terrible at showing images, as we saw with Steve's presentation. I mean, they present very simple things which for them mean something, but for the rest of the people mean nothing. So, first, the technical question. Tim Lenton, who is a great student of, double student of Lovelock. For many Earth system scientists, the planet Earth is really comprised of two systems: the surface Earth system that supports life, and the great bulk of the inner Earth underneath. And if you know any geologists, the real good geologists are the great bulk people. The other one are called superficial geologists, and they are despised most of the time. Because it is the thin layer of the system at the surface of the Earth, and its remarkable property that is the subject of my work. So it's interesting to see that even the notion of thin layer, if you now conjure in your mind what is an Earth that is a thin layer, even if you don't speak about the soil, but if you speak of the whole dimension, which is actually, as Steve showed, the rocks all the way to the undisturbed rocks to the top of a canopy, it is already very difficult to represent. But it's not the planet, it's not the globe, it's a very thin surface, it's a skin. But what does skin mean? We live in the skin. And we don't have a repertoire, the cosmological repertoire, the cosmogonic repertoire to describe this situation, even though it is the only place we ever lived in. And it's not something you see from outside, it's something you are inside. So this is why, of course, many artists are fascinated by this question of Earth and soil and trying to imagine an alternative view, because it's not the globe viewed from outside, like Galilean metaphor. It's not the planet, but it's not the globe, it's not the inner planet, it's a skin. But it's difficult for us to visualize. So I'm working with many scientists, and Jérôme Gaillardet with a colleague on trying to find alternatives, but it's very difficult. See, this is what we produce. It's very ugly, and it has no cosmological dimension you can relate in terms of social science and politics. If you see that sort of thing, and you see, well, we live here, most of you will just yawn, except those who can replace these images by a mass of research. But it's not what we live in. That's always the difficulty with this metaphor. So we are trying to find a way to visualize differently what it means to see this slightly thick, and a thick description, because in fact it has a connection between flat and land is flat, so it is thick. And it's this distinction which I would actually be interested, if we had more time, we would do a little test where I would have asked every one of you to describe when did you shift from land to soil? When did you shift from land as what is actually seen, like in the survey we were described this morning, to soil, which necessarily is a thick description in the socio-anthropological sense, a thick description. And we learned, and we saw today and yesterday how thick it is, and how complex it is made, and how 3D it is. But see, it's very, very different from imagining what it is to live on a planet. When you live on a planet, you see, you are above yourself, you have a space. When you live on the Earth, on Gaia, you are actually seeing it laterally. You are layers among other layers. You are inside. And you are not in space. There is no space for you when you live on soil. It is quite extraordinary. In one of the papers, we had this funny argument made, I think, by you, that as long as we walked on the soil which was not flat, we were sort of where we put our feet, and now we don't. But it's a bit this sort of question. There's a philosophical, artistic, and scientific question of not being able to define where we inhabit. And that's where all of the questions of politics and cosmology get together. The moderns are absolutely unable to describe where they live. So they know they won't live in the modernizing globe. They know that if they go back, it will be a completely archaic and reactionary sort of neo-invented land. But they don't know where they land. So there's a technical difficulty of describing what it is that is the skin seen from the inside and sort of sideways. So we are trying to imagine, working with many different types of scientists, what it would be to see this. This is the classical 3D diagram, which is drawn by an architect. And of course, one of the interesting aspects is the mass, and we discussed that already. So I can go fast. The mass of instrumentation we would need to begin to become sensitive to the situation of this, what I call the third attractor. And here, it's an interesting question that we cannot do without the sciences. It's not only the sciences, of course, as many of you have shown, there are many other feeling attractors, instruments. Still, to become sensitive to this trans skin, we need all these instruments. And the extraordinary aspect of a critical zone report is how much they realize they ignore about the amazing heterogeneity of the soil. And I think that's actually, thinking yesterday of the second line, I think one of the difficulties we have in accommodating on the soil is that it's simultaneously the easiest thing to survey as a surface in a map, and the most heterogeneous object there is. So this critical zone, Steve might disagree with that, Stephen, I don't know, would say we are studying the most heterogeneous pieces of Gaia there is. Atmosphere is a piece of cake, ocean is a piece of cake. But soil means every centimeter, every 10 centimeters, every kilometer, every meter is completely different. And the way someone mentioned patchy, the patchiness of it, I think is a very interesting feature of that soil. The patchiness of it is so amazing that certainly you need to do what these people do in critical zone disaster, which is to equip with some of these elements, kilometer square, small water catchment, and as they say, a small water catchment of the Amazon have the same level of complexity. So it's complexity, it's a level of complexity and level of patchiness, which is of course one of the great reasons why the other side, I mean the sort of more traditional way of approaching science, for example, to consider that the question of the planet is a question of physics, cannot sort of hold the situation in which we are. So there is something very special. See, this is an interesting case I studied in South Sierra in California, which is a big problem of drought. Now it's a big problem, if I understood, flood. There is only one tree which is equipped. Of whole of the Californian tree, which are necessary to build the models of how the water coming from the top of it will end up into the central valley. There's only one tree, which is the representative tree, equipped with, so that we understand not only what happened on the top, but what happened inside and in the ground. So the question of equipment, the question of bringing patchy part of the Earth as Gaia, in intensive care unit is one of the very interesting questions for me, at least as an observer of science, because scientists in this case are outside the laboratory, bringing the laboratory outside as much as we can. But still, the world in which we are is not a laboratory. So contrary to many scientists who are successful because they extend the laboratory out, and we have shown that many times in science studies. This is a case where we actually measure the distance between the laboratory and what happened outside, even though we equip the outside with instruments. So it gives a spirit to the discipline of critical zone, which is very different from the other science I've studied. Yes, we are finished. Oh, I'm sorry. It's not my phone, but still. Still, I'm not supposed to. The umbrella has not moved yet, so. So, what do you want to know about? Okay, so I'm studying all the critical zones. They are always in very interesting places, including Leeds. I don't know which one I've not seen. Which is, okay, how do scientists manage to do the connection between the situation? Here it's Taiwan, which is the most eroded place on Earth, and where they have all sorts of interesting ways to use seismography, in that case, to register the landslide. So it's another type of instrument, seismography, which has been turned into a way to feel the extraordinarily extensive activity and agency, someone mentioned vitality of the land, with another type of instrumentation. So if we were studying all the critical zones as an instrument, we would begin to make what would sort of a repertoire of grammar, of register, of all the way to feel, to become sensitive through sciences to the agitation and activity and vitality, so to speak, of this thin skin, which is, in this case, made of rocks more than soil, because as you see, it's very steep. But there's also this very interesting question, and this is Jérôme Gaillardet, who is my mentor in the discipline on top of there, a friend of Steve, which is also this big question of equipping with instrumentation things which are outside, I mentioned before. So Jérôme is very proud of this potamological cabin, which produce a type of data set even more accurate than what you would obtain in the laboratory, moving the laboratory back to the field. And the whole field of critical zone has been defined originally through very interesting paper showing the distance between the speed at which phenomena occurs in chemistry in the lab and what happened outside. So it's a discipline built, so to speak, on the modesty of science and the interest of science, which is why I think it's very interesting for us to do a careful study. It is to measure the distance between what we would know if we were taking only chemistry and seeing outside in the field how many entities have been actually part of a process slowing it down. Either because it's microbes, even because it's the rocks being factors in different ways, even because, etc., etc. But, contrary to what Steve said this morning, there's no connection whatsoever with humans. So, in all of the things, maybe to create one is very different, but all of the one I saw, they'd never seen a social scientist before seeing me. So, and I'm not very typical of social scientists. So, I think we are very far from any sort of connection. Actually, we are very far. I have to hurry. Well, this is one of our other friends, Professor Dritlich. Again, the whole experience, which is very unusual, if you want. It's not exactly naturalists. We are not naturalists, because we are laboratory-based scientists equipping places in order not to transform it into a lab, but capturing the geochemical cycle as fast and precisely as we want. But we are not concerned by the organism. And that's what fascinates me, because we are absolutely uninterested in a way by the organism taken as such. We are interested in the organism as a carrier of moment in geochemical transformation. So it gives an idea of what would be required if we were supposed to assemble politically the figure of Gaia. Because even if you follow excellent scientists in all these places, there is no organism and there is no human. So it's an infinite number of other entities to integrate into this recomposition of the Earth's surfaces. So you see, I wanted to measure the distance compared to what is the usual sort of piety of ecological thinking, saying everything is related, we are all connected, everything impedes on everything else. Well, okay, you study one tree, there is no tree for an economist or for and there is no animals and there is no human in the critical zone. Steve, I'm not completely off target, right? Well, we will see at the end. Sure. So what is interesting is to measure the immense distance between the political argument that everything is connected and that should be one, and the plausibility of even associating inside the sciences, inside the West, inside the water catchment, etc., just organism, human activity, and geochemical cycle. That's one of the many things I'm interested in. And these are top scientists. Richard is the master of many different disciplines from the case. Now, this is a case, an amusing case. Jérôme is on the left, and he's the head of critical zone in France. On the right, Catherine, and he is the head of the ecological network of observatory. And they are here in a sort of diplomatic encounter, preparing a meeting in Lyon next October, where I will be, and Steve too, to try to imagine what could be possible that these two networks, one studying critical zone, the other studying ethology, and it's called Zone Atelier, could possibly have to talk to one another. This guy has actually, inside his atelier, farmers. So he would be representing more the combination of many of the things we discussed here between agriculture, and actually one of the great person who described many of the things about the use of nitrogen and so on that we discussed here. But it's a completely different network from the other one. And of course there are questions of funding and question of lots of other questions of EU regulation and so on. But it's just to give you an example, but just before we politicize the question of the earth and the question of ecology, we have just to measure the difficulty of making this connection in any sort of realistic and plausible way. Now another thing, and see, this is a terrible way of representing the critical zone, but I isolated it as a pellicule, as a thin skin, for one reason, which is actually through many of the different papers we heard, which is the epistemological status of these sciences. Because when you are here, studying basically things which are connected with Gaia, in my definition of Gaia, you are always embroiled in disputes with farmers, with corporations, with states, and it's inevitable. The epistemological status of people who are studying here is actually an STS type of situation, where you will have people complaining about what you say, and who will be criticizing you, or buying you, or producing, as we saw in the case of peat in Indonesia, alternative false pseudo controversies, so to speak. But this situation is normal here. It's completely different if you study the old universe. So my idea is simply that critical zones should have an epistemological status slightly different from the people who study, I don't know, stars, and the people who study deep earth, because there is no other people who are going to dispute what they say, who could be taken seriously. If you say, well, I don't agree with the physicist idea about the Big Bang, people will say, well, okay, we'll wait you for another time. But if you say, I have a very different views of what the agricultural crop system should be, you cannot, you can say, well, you are just not expert, you are an idiot, but there will be a reaction from one union, from the corporation, from the alternative scientists, from Mr. Trump. You will be embroiled in disputes. And that's, I think, an interesting difference. Also, probably the advantage of trying to figure out this little skin here is to reintroduce this old notion which has been abandoned at the scientific revolution, the notion of physis, which is the old term for a world, Aristotelian and Greek term, to talk about a world made of agents and not of objects. So it's an interesting reuse, and that you see that in, not only in the art, but in many philosophical movements around, which is of course linked to Whitehead and all of this, to reuse the notion of physis as a description not of the whole universe, because that we have no access to. But at least on these disciplines which are epistemologically, by necessity, politicized. Fusis is also the word that allows to talk about lots of transformation and modification, and which has been killed in the 17th century by Galileo's notion of movement. Only one is motion. But none of the things we describe here, from the microorganism to the farmers to the state, is actually a Galilean object. They are all Lovelock agents. So the notion of fusis could be a nice alternative to the notion of nature. But of course the other alternative to the notion of nature is a critical zone, which has all sorts of advantage, especially the word critical and the ambiguity of the word zone. This will be an extension of the notion of critical zone, which might be too extended. Okay, well, how many minutes do you have?
If you could start wrapping up, that would be good.
Okay, well,
you don't have to tell us about Brexit. We tell one another every day.
Yes, but my point was about the notion of territory. Just this one on the ghost acreage, because we discussed that yesterday at the thing. It's a very interesting way of explaining why soil and earth is constantly forgotten. It's because this is England, and this is the ghost acreage of England, owned by England and plowed by England outside of England. And this is a balance between the country who sell their acreage and those own the acreage. And it's an interesting disconnect, because not only is the land that you don't see, but it's the land which is nowhere in the border of your own nation. It's the land which is completely outside. It's an argument invented by Pomerantz in the great book by the diversions between China and Europe. So in terms of post-colonial studies, it's an absolutely essential aspect of the disregard for the question of land. England lived, literally, before Brexit, they invented the idea of living on the acreage of someone else. And so that they solved their question in the beginning of the 19th century of food. But of course, at the scale of the planet, that doesn't work. So it's an interesting concept. All these concepts of rethinking territory are interesting, and I think that has a bearing on my sort of slight worry about the notion of soil, because soil is associated, before this meeting that Anna, Maria, and Greta invented, with what I would call blood soil. That is the one associated with war in the traditional definition of war. If you tell people defend nature, everyone yawns. But if you say defend your territory, everyone is up in arms. And that's the displacement and actually the bane of ecological thinking, is that it always talk about something for which people yawn. Because it's not the territory that people defend. And the question is how you shift from nature to territory without being reactionary. And I think for me, was the great value of this meeting was to find a very small, probably very small way, which is, yes, we defend our territory, but our territory is made of thick description of the soil and another definition of territory, which is what I try to list here, which is on which you depend to subsist. Subsistence is what the old definition of territory. If you don't want territory, we can replace it by land. But there is a distinction between land, territory, soil, ground, which we have to turf. All these words have to be made more precise, but it's also what you are attached, and we talk a lot about attachment, not forgetting that, as was said at the first day, that there are good and bad attachment. And it's not the same to be attached to the old soil as it is to attach to a new soil. And also the artificiality, authenticity, all these questions have to be raised. And it's also what you have to give form to. Geography was great to give form to the traditional, sort of old modernist, important globe. But now we have to invent lots of other ways of representing what we attach to. And of course, territory is what you are ready to defend. So the Trump game here is very useful, because Trump clearly declared war against all the territories of the other nation by saying, get lost, we will pollute you to death. So now we have a clear enemy, which is the great advantage of politics, and we precisely get ecology finally on the war path, which was very difficult before. So thanks to Mr. Trump, the greatest. So now we see, this is one of my last things, which is now I think you understand my little diagram, which is, it's interesting to see that now we try to get progressive, or reuse the notion of progressive and reactionary, not on this axis, which would have been before. 5 years ago, someone in Sheffield, I bet, someone in Sheffield organized rediscovering the soil, it would have been associated with a group of, I don't know, neo-Celt group of something like that, reactionary politics. And I think it would still be possible in France, by the way.
Definitely in Poland.
I could test. I think it would be, and probably in Poland as well. So you see, it's completely bizarre to do a rediscovery of soil, because immediately people think, then you want to go back here, instead of flooding the usual movement toward emancipation. But of course, in all of this thing, no matter if it's post-colonial studies or the thing we said in Europe or America, the progressiveness would mean going somewhere here and recuperating also some of the thing here. So this is why the Indian case is so interesting, because it uses actually reactionary model to talk about another Earth. But there are lots of other things like slow movement, like organic agriculture, which are actually high-tech agriculture turn toward this one. So progressiveness is now what we have to find another shibboleth for defining. Is it progressive or reactionary? Not along this line here, but along this line here. And again, we are very much helped by Mr. Trump, because here clearly we see what does it mean to be reactionary. It's to say, I don't share the earth with you. Get lost, you will be left behind. And that's a very great clarification. The Americans have declared war by saying, we are not in the same earth as you are. We have not the same climate, we don't have the same chemistry, we don't have the same physics, we don't have the same law. Whatever we have sworn, we have done. White supremacy has been transformed into Trump supremacy. Well, the last one, I know it's difficult to represent the earth. The third attractor, I gave a lecture in Frankfurt the other day in a sort of spectacle, and this is my friend artist trying to represent the earth here, but the third attractor, and they decided it cannot be like this, because that would be the old way. It has to be shifted this way, so that the people see it laterally. It means that no one saw anything. So here is the poor me trying to describe that this is the most important thing on which we will land, but no one saw. But that's a political situation. We are in this situation. We are trying to land in a place which has no description. Even though it's widely populated by thousands and thousands of people who have found an alternative to modernism, still we cannot describe it, because it's not the globe and it's not the earth. That's my talk.
That's wonderful. Thank you.